We are all really excited to have you all here. This is the Movement Cafe for the United Methodist Creation Justice Movement. My name is Rashenda, and I live in Oregon, so a little bit farther from some of you, closer to others. This is a movement across the US, although, of course, we are an international and global denomination. So, though our conversations here really are impacting more nationally the issues, this is a global issue, and we're going to be having conversations that are wider as well. We're all included in the conversation. So I want to just let us know this is a safe space in the terms of we are kind to each other. We are people of faith together in this space. And if you have any concerns, please go ahead in the chat and connect with Dawn or Kathy or myself. And I want to, one of the big things is with the Movement Cafe is it's part of the United Methodist Creation Justice Movement. And so I'm going to turn it over to Kathy so she can tell us a little bit more about the movement and how wonderful it is. So go ahead, Kathy.
Thanks, Rashenda, for that welcome, and for all of you for joining us today. As you probably heard, we are recording this, and so the hope is all of these cafes are available both for those of us able to come in real time as well as for those who can't join us at this exact moment, because these conversations are really valuable for all of us. Just so you're aware that is happening. I am an Earth Keeper in the Minnesota Annual Conference, and I invite any of you who choose to put in the chat, where you're calling in from today, so we get a picture of kind of where you're all coming from and the ways that you're involved in this. As Rashenda referred to, this Movement Cafe is a monthly conversation that is hosted by the United Methodist Creation Justice Movement, and we are really a collection of United Methodists from across the connection coming at this in all the ways that we are involved in this institution. The United Methodist Church has a long history of being interested and concerned about creation issues and environmental justice. Increasingly in recent years, there's been a growing urgency that we need to take on bigger actions, and we need to address climate change, we need to address environmental injustices. And so out of that urgency, new things started to emerge. As Earth Keepers gathered at conferences, we discussed ways that we might take on action together. And out of that, the Creation Justice Movement emerged. We have a very active work teams that include a communications team that has a number of channels, a website, our newsletters, this cafe, all of those different ways that we act to find connection and to keep each other informed on what is happening. And we have several other work teams that are working on policy, that are working on local church engagement, on annual conference organizing, which you'll hear some perhaps today on some of the resolutions that have been emerging because of that work. There are teams that are working on eco-worship materials for the season of creation coming up in the fall and for Earth Day and so forth, and more. And so if there's something that you would like to get involved in and you hear either one of those ideas, please reach out. If you have an idea for a new work team to get started, there are new ones bubbling up all the time. There's one in the works for some of the conferences that are now working on encouraging green teams in local churches. So that team doesn't exist yet, but it might very soon. So the last thing I guess I want to just say before we launch into this conversation, there will be more details in this conversation about net zero, what that means, the nitty gritty of what they've been talking about, how to make that happen. But I want to really acknowledge the work that Jenny and Jake and the others on this coalition have been doing to do organizing in an institution. I mean, a lot of us understand organizing in a community sense or even in a small church, but in the institution, which is also what the United Methodist Creation Justice Movement is trying to do, we're working with different groups, different agencies, different rules, different incentives. And we're also still working on relationships, on connecting each other, on finding shared goals and shared actions. And so I'm really impressed and grateful for that kind of important work that Jenny and Jake and that coalition have been underway doing, and hope that this serves as an inspiration for all of us to find ways in our own context, whatever those organizations and networks and relationships are, to keep asking what more might we do together, and to move ahead to do that good work. So I think that's all I'll say, but any further questions, always feel free to reach out. And I'm going to turn it back to you, Rishinda, to take the next step.
Yes, I want to do more of a formal introduction now. I already did some name dropping because we have these marvelous folks here with us. But let me offer a more formal introduction because it's really important. I think that we all know, who's here, sort of leading this conversation, and the tremendous skills and experience that all these folks have. So, Reverend Jenny Phillips is Senior Technical Advisor for the environmental sustainability at Global Ministries. And she works within the agency to integrate sustainability initiatives into disaster response, global health and mission ministries, as well as throughout the denomination with programs for United Methodist conferences and local churches, including Global Ministries Earth Keepers. She is a co-convener for the United Methodist Interagency Just and Equitable Net Zero Coalition. So we are really, really glad that she is here with us. I want to also introduce Jake Barnett. He joined Wespath in January of 2020 as the Managing Director of Sustainable Investment Strategies for Wespath and its subsidiaries investment programs. Jake leads teams that focus on stewardship and engagement, ESG integration, and impact investing, including the Positive Social Purpose Lending Program. Jake previously served at Wespath as a manager and then a director for sustainable investment stewardship. And before Wespath, Jake was an institutional consultant at Morgan Stanley's Greystone Consulting. So Jake currently co-leads the engagement track of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance and serves as the UN Principles for Responsible Investment Scholarship Advisory Committee. And we all know that those committees, those lists, that all that gets really juicy and deep as we build on our expertise, and folks with this kind of expertise are often engaged in multiple ways and multiple levels. I also want to introduce Reverend Jonathan Brake, who is a United Methodist elder in the Western North Carolina Conference, and he began Creation Care Ministry in the Western North Carolina Conference as a founding member of the United Methodist Creation Justice Movement. So this has been going on. He's commissioned as a Earthkeeper in 2016. And in 2022, Jonathan joined the environmental sustainability team at Global Ministries, now overseeing the Global Ministries Earthkeepers program. And you will hear multiple pitches and for Earthkeepers because it's such a wonderful thing that's happening in the United Methodist Church. Today, though, our subject is net zero primarily. And I want to turn it over to Kathy for a nutshell of what are we talking about today.
I think that you will hear the details of what net zero is, but essentially it's how do we get the carbon and greenhouse gas emissions down in terms of what we are contributing. And so how do you calculate that? How do you make those changes? That's the good work of this coalition. So we'll turn it over to is it ready to turn to Jenny and Jake to take the next step? Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. And gosh, it is really fun to see so many faces, names I've seen, people I've known, both in my home in Seattle and my home in Decatur and everywhere in between. And I want to acknowledge that we have Ken Sloan and Jessica Gamache from Discipleship Ministries here, and they are part of the Net Zero Coalition. And so thanks for coming. And if Jake and I miss anything, just jump on in and fill in the gaps. Also, Romulo Flores is here with Global Ministries and UMCOR, and he's a Global Ministries Earthkeeper based in the Philippines. Jojo, I don't know what time it is there right now, but when I was on a meeting with you a few hours ago, you said it was late at night. So I hope you've gotten a little sleep before joining us here, but it's good to have our global connection in this meeting. I'm going to take a moment now to share my screen so that Jake and I can share an overview of this program and the work that is happening through the coalition. All right, so we're talking about the Interagency Just and Equitable Net Zero Coalition. So here's an overview of what we'll be discussing today. We'll talk about what net zero is, why the agencies decided to commit to net zero, what we're doing to work toward this goal, how we are collaborating together and how that's enabling the work, especially with systemic challenges, and how you all can get involved and get connected. So first, we want to give you a sense of what net zero is, what's relevant, and how we think about the scope of the work that we're doing. So the basic definition is that net zero means cutting greenhouse gas emissions as close to zero as possible, with any remaining emissions reabsorbed by the atmosphere, oceans, and forests. Now, this slide is meant to give you a sense of the types of things that we are thinking about when we're making decisions about what to measure. In the world of greenhouse gas emission accounting, we think of emissions in terms of scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 emissions are emissions that we create ourselves. So when I drive a company, I don't have a company car, I don't have a vehicle, but if your organization has a company vehicle, a fleet, trucks, disaster response trailers, any number of vehicles and you're burning gas, those are scope 1 emissions. Same if you're burning fuel on your property, those are scope 1 emissions. You have complete control over the amount and type of fuel you are burning. Scope 2 emissions are emissions that are indirect emissions for purchased electricity like steam, heating, and cooling. So I have control in our building for the emissions that are not generated by the solar on the Global Ministries headquarters or the electricity generated by the solar. The rest of our electricity comes from the grid through Georgia Power. And Georgia Power and the Georgia Public Service Commission control the energy mix. How much of our energy comes from solar, from coal, from nuclear, from gas. And that affects the emissions generated by our particular energy use in our location. Scope 3 emissions are basically all the other things that we do, from traveling to the stuff we buy and how it gets to us and is made and gets rid of it. We get rid of it. The waste generated in our operations, commuting of employees. So these are all indirect emissions where if I'm doing something, I'm not generating the emissions myself when I am on this Zoom call, but there is a server farm somewhere that is using electricity that's generating emissions when I engage in a Zoom call with you all. Those are the types of things that are scope 3 emissions where they're somewhat out of our control, but our actions do have an impact on the emissions generated. In terms of what most agencies are looking at in particular, because this is so broad, right? And so we've had to narrow down how we think about all of this. What we're looking at in particular is on-site electricity and vehicle generation, emission generation, purchased electricity and steam emission generation, and then particularly travel, commuting, working from home, meetings, and investments. Those ones in red in scope 3 are the ones that many of our agencies are choosing to focus on to start with as we try to figure out our baseline emissions and where we most need to focus on making cuts to have significant impact. Jake, I'll turn this next piece over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny, and thank you all for the time today. So we thought it would be helpful to complement what is net zero, to give a little bit of a genesis story as to how did this collective commitment amongst different agencies to net zero come about. The following are some slides that have been lightly adapted that were actually what we presented to the General Secretary's table I think it was you'll see the dates in terms of the progression, but I believe it was 2021. And the starting in terms of the real core commitment that has been made by the agencies that are participating in this is a pledge to achieve net zero emissions across ministries, facilities, operations, and investments, and to leverage the gifts of our connection, putting equity and justice at the center as we build a net zero emission economy by 2050. So that is the core commitment that really informs and that we routinely return back to in terms of, are we moving towards that goal? And you'll see that there's multiple elements of it, many of which Jenny has already spoken about. Facilities and operations are largely in some of that scope 1 and 2. Ministries is something that's fairly complex and idiosyncratic to each agency. It's specific to what your ministry looks like. So we're all taking some different approaches there. And then on investments, there's a number of different approaches, but we at Wespath are trying to bring some of the information we're gaining from coalitions like the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance to those conversations. We'll talk a little bit more about the equity and justice piece towards the tail end of the conversation, but that is something that was really brought forth in a powerful way by our colleagues at Church and Society and United Women in Faith. As we're moving towards this net zero future, one thing we want to be really cognizant of is that it is not unintentionally creating injustice and furthering inequity. That's a really complex proposition as to what that looks like, but it's a conversation, once again, we are returning back to on a really regular basis, and I'll share some of the questions that we've been asking ourselves a little bit later in the presentation. Next slide, please, Jenny. What are the purposes of the collective commitment? Encouraging collaboration among agencies. We'll give some short examples of that in a little bit, but I think to the very kind words that Kathy shared at the beginning, that relational connectivity piece has been one of the powerful outcomes of this. I can speak personally in saying one of my greatest gratitudes, in addition to the work we'll be sharing a little bit later, is a deepened relationship with folks like Jenny and John Hill and Ilka Vega, who are doing really important work. And now I feel much more comfortable kind of reaching out to, having conversations, bouncing ideas off of. So that's been a really rich growth personally, and I think for others as well, in terms of that collaboration among agencies to explore where there's room for innovative climate action. Facilitate sharing of best practices and learning on how to support a just transition to net zero. So that refers to some of the conversations that we've hosted with different people presenting different perspectives on investment approaches. It certainly refers to conversations that have taken place where Jenny has brought in resources that she's aware of, to look at operations and facilities, GCFA supporting us in a guidelines for how to think through travel is a example we'll talk through a little bit more. And then leveraging the gifts of our connection to support United Methodists in their emission reduction work. That's this conversation that we're having right now. We were grateful to get the invitation by Kathy and Rashinda to share some of what our learnings have been. We were intentional in going into this commitment and making it an agency specific commitment because we really felt there were shared institutional opportunities and challenges to navigate at the agency level that we wanted to collaborate and commit to. But we've been intentional, and we'll share a little bit more in a moment about how do we talk through our learnings, how do we share any best practices with the broader United Methodist Church that might be relevant beyond the scope of agencies. To give you a little bit more of a sense of how this came about in our initial thinking, which holds true today as to where we're focused on for this coalition, Jenny and I thought sharing a short video that we put together at the inception of this coalition, talking through why we were doing it and what the focus would be a good grounding. So Jenny, I think you have that on the next slide, and I will turn it over to you to get that running.
The United Methodist Church has long affirmed our individual and collective responsibility to address the unfolding climate crisis. We are called by our faith, informed by science, and led by impacted communities to respond with renewed urgency. Today, we share our commitment to net zero emissions.
The genesis of this joint United Methodist climate commitment emerged through conversations among 5 general agencies that already engage in environmental stewardship ministries. The urgency to reduce harmful emissions that contribute to climate change continues to make global headlines. We recognize the value and potential impact that a denomination-wide United Methodist Church initiative could have if we synchronize our voices and coordinate our efforts. We decided to start by inviting our agencies to consider a net zero goal by 2050, aligned with United Nations targets.
Put simply, the term net zero describes the processes by which human-induced greenhouse gas emissions are balanced, are netted out, by removing emissions from the atmosphere. We have seen strong momentum to net zero commitments by 2050. In alignment with guidance from the world's leading climate scientists, corporate commitments to net zero have tripled in the last year, and 70% of global GDP is now covered by countries that have made net zero commitments.
This commitment aligns our agency's actions with our United Methodist values. Now, General Conference has long stated that we have a responsibility to address the climate crisis. This important step gives life to those words, committing us to achieve net zero emissions and to do so in a way that addresses racial and gender inequities. This is an exciting opportunity for us, together, to live into our United Methodist vision of justice for God's people and for God's planet.
Several agencies are already working toward emission reduction. Global Ministries gathers data on energy usage at key locations from its headquarters to health clinics. UMW leads meetings and campaigns promoting the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. GBCS advocates for policies that reduce emissions as called for in the social principles. Wespath develops sustainable investment portfolios, and GBHEM supports sustainable practices and initiatives at schools, colleges, seminaries, and universities. These activities are also involving other agencies, annual conferences, local churches, organizations, and networks related to the United Methodist Church, thus expanding our collective ability to justly transition to net zero.
How these commitments are fulfilled will vary by agency, conference, and UMC entity, as well as their particular ministry and location. By partnering in this effort together, we have the opportunity to learn from one another and create and share best practices that will help us reach net zero goals and implement sustainable solutions that are centered on justice and equity.
United Methodists are in an uphill battle against the mass suffering created by climate-exacerbated disasters, crop failures, disease, and migration. When we engage in mission and ministry that generates greenhouse gases, we perpetuate that suffering. We must seek a better way to do ministry, and none of us can do it alone. But maybe, just maybe, we can do it together.
So you can hear a consistency in terms of the message, and thank you, Kathy, for putting a link to the video and other resources in the chat. Even though it was a number of years ago, I noticed that was a pre-beard Jake Barnett. It was still one that we consistently have kept that focus in terms of what the overall goal is. To put some specificity around what the timeline looked like for the development, there was kind of a standing informal meeting of the 5 agencies represented in that video, where we had been talking about mutual climate work that we were all engaging in, that started to accelerate really with conversations between Cynthia Dopke from Wespath's Church Relations Department and Jenny in the summer and fall of 2020. As we drafted an initial statement, started to move towards conversations that were a bit more formalized in terms of the presentation of that core commitment, we found that there was good take up. There was certainly some good feedback as to how to adapt and tune that statement to make it resonate more broadly with the agencies. And then we were very happy with the broad adoption of it by multiple agencies when we officially launched it in the spring of 2021. What we've been working on since then, and what I'll turn it back to Jenny to talk a little bit more about, is kind of a dual purpose focus. Both how do we learn how to do this in an internal facing way that focuses on our operations, facilities, and ministries? How do we also do it in a way that enables the type of systemic change that we all know is necessary to move the broader global economy and society towards a just and equitable net zero? So Jenny, I'll turn to you to talk about that a little bit more.
Thank you, Jake. And I just want to say again, I appreciate Kathy saying, acknowledging the work it takes to move an institution. As I look back at that history and listen to Jake tell a little bit of that story, know that just as for some of you, it is challenging to engage change in your conferences or your churches. It takes a lot of time and a lot of conversation. And a lot of sitting with people as they feel the discomfort of what change looks like. And that happens in every place, even when all you see is the announcement about a decision or a change at the end. You're not alone if it's hard work and time consuming to do the behind the scenes work that leads to that announcement. So this next piece is how we are working toward the goal. We started with a really basic step, learning to use Energy Star Portfolio Manager. This is a great free program that is paid for by the taxes of US citizens that helps entities input information about their energy consumption as well as their water and trash consumption. And this allows both you to get information, weather normalized information about how your building is performing relative to other similar buildings in your area. So like if you're in a church, for example, it will look at other churches in your area. It will look at your energy consumption in relation to the others, and it will know, oh, this was a bad winter. Everybody was using more energy because the temperature was lower than normal, for example. And they'll, through their analysis, give you an analysis of how your building is performing. So you have a sense of the potential opportunity to reduce your energy consumption. And then it can also generate a greenhouse gas emissions report, again, using location-based data related to your local utility. It knows the energy sources that your utility uses and the mix. And so through that, it can generate a greenhouse gas emission report based on your utility use and your gas use. So it's a really basic tool. It's really the first thing to do if this is something you're considering for your church or your conference, is to learn to use Energy Star Portfolio Manager. I think somebody put, oh, yep, there's links there already just for you. And there are folks who can help. We then said, okay, well, if we're going to say we're moving toward a goal, we need to start reporting on a goal. The first two steps we took were to put together a resource website. And I'm wondering if someone might have that on hand and put it in the chat. I should have had it on hand, but there's a great resource website that shares all the resources we're sharing here and has the videos. And we'll be adding over time stories from the different agencies. And then we put together an initial report of the work we had done to begin figuring out how to figure this out, how to establish our baseline emissions and what we were going to track initially, and how each agency was starting to engage. Thanks, Kathy. And this commitment has 4 areas. Ministries is related to aligning existing ministries with this commitment. And again, every agency is different because every agency has a different area of ministry focus. facilities. Again, this is so much about our building emissions. And so we have worked together as agencies to do training on Energy Star and also on greenhouse gas emission accounting. Within operations, the agencies work together to develop a decision tree to help agencies develop policies and practices related to reducing emissions from travel, because many agencies engage in quite a bit of travel to be able to connect with the many ministries with which we're affiliated. But we're now really trying to figure out, well, how can we better use the technology we have with Zoom and other resources? How can we make decisions about engaging local leadership more effectively so that agency staff don't have to travel so much? How can we use different forms of transportation, consolidate meetings? All of these are strategies that, that different agencies are engaging in different ways, but using some shared collective information and strategies developed through GCFA. With investments, Wespath put together a dedicated net zero investment workshop that was shared with all the agencies in fall of 2022. And with equity and justice, Church and Society and United Women in Faith have provided workshops and training on broad justice issues as well as advocacy. Jake, would you like to talk a little bit about how our collaboration is engaging broader challenges?
Yeah, I ask for people's grace on these next couple of slides because we're going to be presenting you to use a how the Beyond Meat sausage is made rather than a finished product in terms of where we are in some of these conversations. Systemic challenges on net zero, as you all know from working on this at an organizing standpoint, it's really challenging. It's, you know, there's a lot of embedded momentum to the energy and economic system as it exists today. There's a lot of inequity and injustice in that system. And so how you create a just and equitable transition to net zero is a large conversation that we approach with a lot of humility, but try to consistently make space for in our conversations. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see some of where we have wrestled with these global issues together. For those of you, many of you might be familiar with the Conference of Party negotiations, but just a very brief synopsis. The UN hosts annual meetings, which are kind of the largest venue for global climate negotiations between different countries and many different stakeholders, called the Conference of Parties, or COP. The COP negotiations are where the Paris Agreement originated from, which has been such a powerful rallying cry for those of us involved in advocating for climate justice. And they've also sometimes been a source of frustration for many in the community in terms of not seeing the momentum and urgency of action that many believe is necessary. Jenny, myself, John, and Ilka Vega were really, I was certainly very humbled to receive an invitation on behalf of John with Church and Society, and I know Jenny was grateful as well to be able to attend the COP in Egypt this past year. The experience of going and really wrestling with those global issues together was a really profound one for me, and one that I think if you are interested in seeing what the interplay in different conversations we were having live was like, would encourage you to go to the UMCOM resource and watch a replay of the webinars that that UMCOM was kind enough to host, showing and showcasing our conversations in those moments. But what you'll see is a intersectionality in terms of what our different ministries and perspectives were really informing in that conversation. Jenny certainly was coming with a really rich experience in terms of what does climate finance, what role does philanthropy have to play in helping to enable the transition? John was a really wonderful grounding in terms of just the realities of these policy discussions and how they rolled out, and the minutia and sometimes the frustration, but also the opportunity that was present in those rooms. I was able to take place in some different convenings relating to climate finance and broad regulation around economic policy that were informing and certainly informed by those different discussions. And then Ilka had shared a really strong sense of solidarity with climate justice activists there, and was coming with the United Women in Faith focus on organizing. So in those discussions, it was just a really rich opportunity for all of us to be informed and informed by the different perspectives that we were bringing. And although that's not a specific, just and equitable net zero coalition event, the raising up of our collective Methodist voices in that global conversation, I'm confident would not have happened in the way it did without this coalition and the relational connectivity that it brought having come about. Expanding a bit on the next slide in terms of some of the just and equitable net zero conversations, I sharing with you all some anonymized responses to a agency responses to a conversation that was convened by Church and Society and United Women in Faith, where we gave we coordinated with them to be the primary presenters on some information relating to just and equitable considerations on net zero. This included a presentation from a prominent climate justice activist who works a lot on solidarity issues. And you can see some of the conversations and questions and kind of learnings that were present from that discussion. You all might have discussed the idea of what's the difference between net zero and just zero. A very brief synopsis of what that difference could look like is, oh, great. I'm glad to hear Jackie Patterson was present here as well. She's a wonderful speaker and leader in the space. But for those of you that might not be as familiar, net zero could mean that you're still burning coal in a community of color, or natural gas, and having a disproportionate health impact on that community if you're sequestering it. That carbon in another community. That's not just, even if technically you get to net. And so we were really being challenged on some of those ideas by Jackie, and you can see people wrestling with some of the learnings and some of the personal transformation that they're going to be bringing forth into this work that we think is really important. Moving on to just our closing before we open it up to more broad communal discussion with you all, which we're looking forward to. Where can you get involved? Certainly, we've put the UMCOM website in there, and we hope that there's some useful resources and educational pieces that might be relevant. We're very committed to continuing to update that. Something that we're working on moving forward is having video profiles of each of the individual agencies talking through what they're doing and how they're collaborating, how this collaborative has helped enable further work on their behalf. So please keep a lookout for that. Obviously, where appropriate and helpful, we encourage you to bring some of these resources to your church or annual conference. And we know that many are already leveraging the work that we've been doing here, which we're very grateful for. And then I'll put in another plug for Earth Keepers. I went through the program with Jenny, and it was a really rich experience. So if you haven't yet, would encourage you to do so. And I know Jonathan is here as well, and he was a wonderful resource in that, as well as just thinking through where there's opportunities for advocacy with Church and Society, where they do work on climate justice. Certainly United Women in Faith does some wonderful organizing in this respect. So kind of getting involved with wherever that agency creation care work is taking place that you're intersecting with. I know Discipleship Ministries gives rich opportunities for reflection and further commitment on some of these issues. So would encourage everybody to just look to the agencies and take advantage of where they are doing this work individually. With that, I think that's our closing of prepared remarks. So happy to take questions or go to breakouts. I will turn it back to our wonderful organizers.
Awesome. Oh my gosh, so much there, so much good information. And I really appreciated how you unpacked some of those bigger words. I'm not a finance person, right? I mean, at church council, we get to see the lists of the budget, and it's really awesome to see how that connects with the larger work of the denomination, all the way through what we do in our ministries, how we get back and forth to our youth groups, all those things really end up making a difference. So thank you for that. I'm going to call on John.
I apologize.
Go ahead,
I
Jen.
just wanted, I received a request in the chat for the resources shared in the chat to be emailed out. Is that something that's part of the program? Perfect.
Absolutely.
So if you're seeing stuff in the chat and it's going by fast, there'll be an email coming your way with those resources later.
I also try to embed them in the video, so it should be very accessible. That's our goal, is to equip you, make sure you have the things you need. In a minute, I'm going to ask Jonathan Brake to share a little bit about what this looks like in the conferences, how conferences might be moving towards this work. And I know many people here are engaged in this work, so that's very exciting. But first, we just have another couple minutes with Jake and Jenny specifically. I wanted to ask you just quickly, what called you into this work? Why do you care? Why don't you just get up from your desk and walk away, right? This hard work, but it's also joyful work. So I'm wondering, what calls you to this work? What got you started? I don't know, Jenny, you want to start? I see you're smiling, so I'm guessing there's something.
Well, gosh, there's a lot of questions in there. How to get started? Oh my goodness. I feel like I could share a lot about this, but I think that the thing that drives me right now is just a sense of acceptance of the climate crisis. If you look at the climate crisis through a lens of grief and the stages of grief, I spend time in all stages of grief when I'm engaging the reality of what's happening to the world, to places I love, and to places and people I've never met, and knowing the world that my children are inheriting. Of course, we should be grieving, and we are, whether we acknowledge it or not. But the more I can engage that and spend time in a place of accepting the reality of what we're doing and what's happening in the world, not accepting that nothing can be done, not a despair place, but a place of well, here's where we are. And here's where I sit in my tiny spot in this great world. What can I do to leverage the resources I have where I am right now? It happens to be in a church agency. So I'm doing everything I can for as long as I'm appointed here to leverage the resources of this agency toward doing ministry more sustainably and helping others do the same. So, and that's limited, right? It's big and it's also really small. But if I can stay grounded and focus on, well, what can I do with where I am and the resources I have right now, I can feel effective and feel like I can make progress and live into what the work I believe God is calling me to do.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that. I love how you frame that in terms of grief too, because I think that is something that all of us do experience in some way. Jake, do you have a way do you want to share with us, what called you here? What keeps you?
Yeah. I'm gonna give a lot of my calling to Wespath, my gratitude for that space, to a rich history in the sustainable investing space of leadership by Catholic women religious. It was really the nuns that charged forward on a lot of these conversations that have been talking to companies for 30 plus years on issues of equity, justice, climate. And I had the wonderful privilege of working and having as a mentor Sister Pat Daly. If you haven't read about Sister Pat Daly, she was a titan in climate investment, and she's worth a read. And unfortunately, she passed a short while ago, and I was reading an obituary of hers in the New York Times, and one of the things that it was actually the CEO of Southern Company who said this. So not your typical kind of climate activist or social justice oriented individual, but he said, Sister Pat always was challenging and courageous in how she brought up conversations, and I could always tell it was also coming from a deep place of love. It was love for people, love for planet, love, and including love for this individual who is one of God's creation. And I think as a faith-based investor, and as an institutional faith-based investor, something that I have a forum to talk about is the power, the challenge, the difficulty of trying to live into love in these conversations rather than just operating with your left brain, as so many in the finance industry do. And so that's a kind of, I haven't figured out, it's actually I'm delinquent on some of my Earth Keepers training with Jenny, because that's the topic I'm really wrestling with, that I went through the Earth Keepers training on, was how to bring this faith voice into investment in a powerful way, because I think they're so intertwined in terms of what the path forward needs to look like.
That's awesome, Jake. Absolutely. Yeah. What are you invested in? Jesus asked that question, right? Where's your heart? And really, really grateful for both of your work. I want to call on Reverend Jonathan Brake just for a few minutes. He's of course deeply engaged in this work and has been, as well as working directly with the Earthkeeper program now and within his home conference. And so, Jonathan, do you want to share a little bit about what this looks like on the ground?
Thanks, Shinda. So, as you know, we're a connectional church, and our agencies and boards are one part of that connectionalism, and they're giving us some guidance and some leadership in their spheres of influence. And different annual conferences are different from one another geographically and demographically and so forth, in the way that we function. And so every annual conference has a different approach to this. There are some, like the Northern Illinois Conference, that has put together a team and a workbook and is moving forward on net zero. And then other conferences are taking a different approach. I come from the Western North Carolina Conference, and we have, for instance, a Gold LEED certified conference center that is covered with solar panels. And we just installed some EV charging stations in the parking lot there. And so our conference leadership and design and going forward is taking it very seriously to go as close to net zero as we can from that perspective. And yet, rather than legislatively going from the top down on net zero to all of our churches, the ideal is, let's look at grassroots and how can we empower local churches to step forward and move in this direction as well. And so different approaches from different annual conferences. I am privileged to have been on an email string with a lot of folks over the last few weeks as resolutions have come up and been approved and passed in various annual conferences across the country. And there are different approaches, how each one is dealing with and trying to move forward on cleaning up the response that we have, and the ways in which we are a part of what's going on in our natural world. And so I'm just excited to see the creativity and the ways in which we're going. And so, Rishan, I don't know if you want to see who on here has a specific way that their annual conference is tackling this issue, but I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, I would say put it in the chat. So there are a number of people working on this, and really, really excited for the energy that is bubbling up. In a minute, I'm going to put in the task force website for Northern Illinois Conference, because their website is so helpful in terms of, jogging that, well, what could we do in our conference? Pacific Northwest Annual Conference passed a net zero resolution just last week. So here we go, right? Strap in and let's figure this out together is kind of a cool next step for many of us. I also want to open it up for questions. I know there are folks here that might want to share about what their experience has been. We have a few minutes for that. I'm also cognizant that Jake and Jenny and Jonathan are here and their ears are open right now. If you have a question that you would like to ask, you could use the raise hand feature. That's the easiest way for me to identify. Okay, Wendy, I see your hand, so go ahead.
Jonathan asked me to expand on something I said to one of the hosts. We just had our annual conference, and I had mentioned something that Catherine Hayhoe said is to talk to them about saving money. But then yesterday I saw on TV the governor of Georgia has just signed a bill putting a new electric vehicle plant into his state. He got it approved not by talking climate, but by talking making money for the state. And somebody else came in and said, what progressives need to do is learn to talk Republican. And that means when you have somebody who's a climate denier or doesn't want to hear about climate, you say, well, look, if you do this and this and this, you can make money for your state. Or here are the savings your state can get. For instance, solar saves a huge amount in electric. For homes and churches, LED can save a ton in electric. So when you're talking to people, because right now we're talking to the choir, we're preaching to the choir. And to talk to people who are not in that choir, you have to use different words to get across the same point. And also, we did a survey here of our churches, and many of the churches said, we don't have time for that right now. We're trying to grow the congregations. But our director of justice and outreach pointed out that those churches grow who have a dedicated mission to helping their community. And when the community says they have a mission that's really helping their community, you draw more people in. And the more people you draw in, the more you can teach about saving money and also making money. There are a lot of really good jobs in the solar industry, in wind power, in all these other things. So for those folks, you promote what will interest them, and they don't want to hear climate. So you can do the whole thing without mentioning climate. And our annual conference just promoted everything we've just been talking about, voted plus by over 80%. So we're on the path.
That's awesome, Wendy. That's awesome. I just love the really focused energy there and this, invitation to get out of our bubble, right? Like all of us are in a bubble, and to really take time to see if we can't reach listening towards others and hear what they might be, what their values might be, and how to connect with them. So thank you. Thank you. I see, Kim, you have your hand up, and I hope I'm not spilling the beans about the wonderful thing that happened in New England Conference, where a new climate coordinator is starting work July 1st. So I'm going to let you share if you have a question or if you wanted to share about that.
Thanks, all. I actually have a question for all the agency people on right now. I got an email just yesterday saying that the infrastructure bill 50 million grant for nonprofits, which specifically names churches, is looking for umbrella grants from bigger agencies that then dole it out to their own organizations. I may have misread the email wrong. I'm operating on memory, but I thought the deadline was June 29th for this application. So I'm wondering who's on top of this and what are we doing?
I don't know who wants to take this. Go ahead, Jenny.
Well, I can say a word about the program I think you're referring to is the Renew America's Nonprofits program. Like you said, it's a $50 million grant program from the Department of Energy that is to assist nonprofits in energy efficiency interventions. The way it's structured is that large grants of $3 to $9 million will be given to prime applicants applicants who then distribute the grants what are they called? They've got special names for everything, subrecipients, I think it is. So the large grants are $3 to $9 million, distributed in sub grants to up to $200,000. And they are giving out between 5 and 15 grants total to prime organizations. There has been a lot of interest from faith communities. I can tell you that Global Ministries took a very hard look at becoming a prime applicant. We ultimately determined that it would not work for us to do so because of the criteria within the grant. And I don't want to get into too much detail here because I don't think everybody's interested in this, but there's certain criteria in the grant related to where materials are made, how labor is secured, and other issues that we didn't feel operating on a national scale we would be able to provide the proper audit trail or to ensure that we could secure the type of labor and materials needed for the subrecipients that would be potentially working with us. So that's kind of a short answer. It's more complicated than that, but that's where Global Ministries is. I am keeping my ear to the ground for a faith-based organization that is trying to become a prime and is looking for churches or open to churches being part of their group. I don't know of any at this time, but there's a lot of dialogue about it. The deadline for a letter of intent is June 29th, but a letter of intent is not required to apply. And the actual application is due, I think, August 25th, but I'm not sure.
What I really like about this question and exchange is that the part of this is, where's the money going to come from, right? We need support in our churches for funding net zero. It will get a lot just by paying attention, right? But beyond that, things like solar is funding. And Jenny, I see you want to follow that up, so go ahead.
Yeah, well, and I do. The other thing I want to say is that this grant is going to be hyper competitive. Like, there are so many organizations applying who are set to apply now. But I will say part of the gift of the conversation that has come is it feels like, I don't know what the thing is yet, but there is real energy for increasing organizing around collaboration to seek funding. And I think that many of us who've been involved in studying this, conversing about it, we're just trying to think in new ways, both about like where the money is and how to be prepared to try to access money that different organizations have the capacity to manage under the ways that grants are managed. So I want to say that like whatever happens with this program, this is a small pilot program in the big picture of potential funding, and there's more conversation and opportunity to be had in the future.
That's awesome. I want to recognize Judy. At the same time, I also want to say this is our 5-minute warning before breakout groups. So the chat is open. If you have more questions to pour in there, that's great. And Judy, I want to go ahead and call on you.
Okay. Yeah, I've been working for a long time with a bunch of folks in Mountain Sky that have been really anticipating being part of being subrecipients on this grant, perhaps with a conference as an umbrella group. And Jenny and I are going to be talking more about this along with Kathy and some others next week. But the deadline is August 3rd for the FOA, not August 25th. And we really have an opportunity here for our churches and all the nonprofits they work for to support them in disadvantaged to support folks in disadvantaged and tribal areas to get up to $200,000 to make significant efficiency improvements in their buildings with only a 20% investment of their capital. Now, I know this is a pilot project. I really believe there's got to be somebody in our conference that can help us put together a portfolio of just 5 to 15 large, small churches, schools, daycare centers, food folks that could be in our portfolio that could make this actually get the attention and become the kind of thing that could expand to make a difference throughout our conference. So, you know, I'm hoping that we've prepared an LOI to submit as a subrecipient, and I learned yesterday that I have to be a prime to have that committed. So maybe we can talk about some interim opportunities too, to how to make this happen. Folks that are excited about it are welcome to get in contact with me. We've got a bunch of folks at Mountain Sky, and I know South Carolina is interested as well.
Yeah, and this topic of conversation came up at the United Methodist Christian Justice Movement annual conference organizing group conversation. Mary Beth, of course, is wonderful and deeply engaged, just as you are, Judy, and a bunch of people, like you say, at Mountain Sky is just awesome, and they're just a rocket ship doing this stuff. So these conversations are happening. They're going to continue to happen. You can contact also Kathy Velasquez Eberhardt and say, hey, I'm really interested in this funding and who's putting this together. And she knows a lot of who's doing what and can really help connect you. And we have 2 minutes left, but I wanted to give Jake and Jenny or Jonathan a chance to respond to Judy's question, or if there's something that you wanted to respond to in there.
Well, everything Judy says is true. Everything she says is true.
Oh, that's awesome, right? So okay, so yes. So, and here's the other thing is Jenny has been a tremendous resource for a United Methodist Christian Justice Movement, really making available time what she has in spades and generously. Same with Jake, and also Jonathan has also been a leader of the movement for a good while. So you're looking at a whole. Just take a big picture of the Zoom room, all the folks that are deeply engaged in this. And if you're new to this, if this is some new information to your ears, if you're feeling a little lost or a little hopeful, know that you're in the right place. Connect, throw out an email to Kathy or Judy or Jenny or Jake or Jonathan, and they can connect you in and help you very much with what comes next. Okay, before we go to breakout rooms, Jake, Jenny, Nathan, Jonathan, we have 1 minute, but I want to give you a chance. Is there anything that you want to say before we do that?
Just thank you all for the work you're doing. I am always grateful to get into these rooms to hear from those folks, that hear from the individuals that are really pushing this throughout the church, and your voices are really valued. Thank you.
And I just want to invite Jonathan to say a word about the Earth Keepers program and how it can help those who are excited to make a thing happen, whether it's a grant or another net zero intervention, how the program can help. Jonathan?
Sure, thanks, Jenny. So many of you are aware of our Global Ministries Earth Keepers program. We have trained over 270 people over 7 years to be local agents of change and action on the ground in churches and communities. And we continue that process. Coming out of the pandemic, we are getting ready to host our first in-person training since 2019. And one of the ways in which we're trying to reach our net zero direction is by having one weekend in 3 different locations. And so Jenny's putting up here, or someone's putting up here on the screen, some information here. So our Earth Keepers program will be held on October 5th through 8th in Birmingham, Alabama, Denver, Colorado, and Hartford, Connecticut. How we came up with that was we were trying to decrease the amount of travel and distance that participants would have to take. And so by doing it this way, we're hoping that people will drive rather than fly across the country, but drive to the nearest location so that they can be connected with others. We can build the coalition of those working with one another and take some ready-made projects and ideas and concepts back to our home locations and carry out this great work. And so Earth Keepers is doing some amazing things on all different levels, and energy efficiencies is one of those. We have a couple of Earth Keepers who just came through the last training that are working on solar installations for churches, as well as energy efficiencies in the churches that ties directly into most of what we've been talking about today, and there's room for others. And so if you or someone you know would be a great candidate for the Earth Keepers training, please be in touch with us. You can scan that QR code, move the little, there you go, indicator off of it, get a good scan on that QR code, or you can reach us at the address you see there on the screen, and we'll put that in the chat and in the email that goes out as well. But share the news, spread the news in your annual conferences, and encourage folks to come and be a part of our Earth Keepers training. They can be in touch with me if there are any questions or things that we can help you with. And we look forward to a great year as more and more of our United Methodist clergy and laity are trained and prepared to carry out the work that God is calling us to.
So I am about to hit the breakout room button, and how this works is I've put in just the first name of the person, Jenny, Jake, and Jonathan, who will be leading a breakout room. And you get to choose which room you want to join. And if you need help with assigning, with being in a room, you just let me know, and you can get assigned to whichever room you would choose.
That was too short. You gotta make
It's
those
always too
those
short.
curves
I know,
longer.
it's never long enough. Is there, as we gather back, we have about 5 more minutes before we wrap things up. And was there anything that came out in those calls, those very too short conversations? If you need to get reconnected with somebody to continue the conversation in another space, please let us know. We can help facilitate that. But anybody have any highlight to lift up, or any major feedback from those conversations? Anything?
Something I would just say briefly that we were talking about, and I'll give the same caveat I gave in the thing of I was previously a financial advisor. I'm no longer licensed to give financial advice, so this is not financial advice. But in your own investments and portfolio, a conduit to go to is to ask about how are you incorporating climate risk, how are you thinking through sustainable investing and reflecting that in what we're doing. We had a brief conversation on that in my section. I know Jane had some resources as well to share on that she might be able to share on that, but just another conduit people don't always think about.
That sounds like a good topic for a future newsletter and/or cafe. All the different ways our financial tools could be put to work here. Jane, was there something where you'd like to add?
I'm involved with a group called Third Act, which is activists over 60 addressing climate change. And I work specifically with the Faith Working Group. And one of the things we're doing is trying to empower people to make financial choices and, as we say, cut off the money pipeline. So I have just posted a link to where you can look for banks and credit cards that are not funding fossil fuel expansion, at least. And you can also see on there more about Third Act.
Excellent. That's such a great resource. We'll add it to our list of things to include in the next newsletters. Yeah, Jenny.
Well, one thing that came up in our group that I want to mention to everyone is there are some folks who are thinking, well, how can we move toward net zero emissions in our local church? And I will say that greenhouse gas emission tracking is a challenging task, and it may or may not be the right task to take on. If you're looking for an effective focus, one way you might focus your energy is toward an emission reduction goal of 30% by 2030 for your church building. You can usually identify 30% of ways to, or 30% emission reduction through an energy audit. By going through an energy audit, ASHRAE 2, level 2 energy audit, to have your building, your windows, your lighting, your systems evaluated, they typically come up with 30% electricity savings that can be implemented in a church building. So it's a challenging goal and a doable goal that can really focus folks and save money at the same time.
And I would just add to that, sometimes there are state level resources that are available. So per the conversation we were having about federal resources, do check on the state level. Property assessed clean energy PACE programs can sometimes help provide financing that enables those types of projects.
Nice. Nice. Well, I know this conversation could go on much longer, and don't worry, the creation justice movement will be continuing these conversations in just about every space that we can find to do that. We would like to, though, keep us on time and close with a prayer. I have a prayer ready, but I wanted to check to see if somebody else was already primed and ready. Rashinda had to get off early, and she may have asked somebody, but no, nobody's ready. Okay. What I'd like to share with you is we have a wonderful worship team that has been developing resources. And so I'm going to read one of those prayers that was developed for the spring resources. So please join me in prayer. Shepherd God, who leads with gentleness, forbearance, and mercy, God who leads us on the right path, who protects us even from death, we call to you now. Forgive us, Lord, we have drained the crystal lakes, we have clear-cut the forest, we have left your path. Accept our confession and lead us again, that we may be renewed stewards of a natural, green, and sustainable earth. Let your goodness and mercy follow us all the days we celebrate life. Amen. So I again welcome. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. I will stick around until the last of you are off, but I want to just again thank Jenny and Jake and Jonathan and all of you for your participation today, and look forward to continuing the conversation. Have a wonderful rest of your day.